I know many of you regulars know the basic outline of my story, but just briefly, so for those who are new, my story is I, again, raised Catholic, fell away from the faith after high school, became an atheist, that kind of thing. And then during the autumn of 1985, I was 25 years old or so, and I returned to the faith. I was living up on Finn Hill in Kirkland, and I was renting a house with some other guys, going to school. And I was reading about the faith, curious about it. And then that one day when I was lying on my couch, and I suddenly had this realization that I was no longer simply a curious non-believer, I had become a believer. And that realization sort of forced me to say, okay, I need to go back to Mass. I didn't know what else to do. I needed to do that. I didn't know where the closest church was, so I found out it's at John Vianney's parish up in northern Kirkland. And so that Sunday morning, snuck out of my house and didn't really want people to know, but went to Mass, snuck in, snuck out, didn't talk to anybody. So my point is simply, at that point, I was a believer, but I was not yet a disciple. So a disciple of Christ is not someone who just believes that he is the Lord. Disciples are people who allow their identities to be formed primarily by that relationship with Jesus. So our lives consist of many relationships. And a human person, we don't exist in isolation. We are formed and we identify ourselves and we conceive of ourselves in terms of these relationships. Again, that's hard, who am I? That's how we know who we are. So I wanted to start with an example of that kind of relationship. So about 9 months after I snuck into the back of that church, I headed off to graduate school. So I wanted to be a history professor. So I was going for a PhD in history, studying at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Now, for those who don't understand graduate school, you're not really just applying to a university. What you really are doing, you're applying to a professor. You need an advisor. Someone's going to take you on. Otherwise, if nobody wants you, you're not going to go to the university at that level. So you're applying to study under this particular scholar. She will spend 5 years plus working with you, editing your dissertation, getting you a job, you hope. So again, it's that kind of relationship. You say, who's going to be able to have enough pull to get me a tenure-track position? And how can I impress this person so they will? That's the kind of relation. The relationship becomes central to your life. So when I arrived in Baltimore to Johns Hopkins, I realized I had taken on a new identity. So this is a very intense little world. 100, 150 graduate students and 30 professors, something like that. And I now was known as a Green student. So Jack Green was a colonial American historian there. And my friends were Pocock students. They were Forrester students. They were Walter students. Again, who was your advisor? That's who you were. You're a disciple of them. So we were each bound with that scholar. We'd do the teaching assistants for their classes, that kind of thing. So again, in that all-consuming world, this was a primary relationship. This is who I was. So I thought about that experience in terms of what John the Baptist is doing today in the gospel. So in the gospel, we hear how he's answered the question put to him by the priests and the Levites. And the question is, who are you? So again, they have some suspicions. Maybe you're the Elijah come back at the end of time. Maybe you're the prophet Moses spoke about that was going to come in the future. Maybe you're the Messiah himself. And John denies all these possibilities. He denies those identities. Instead, what he says is, I'm the voice of one crying out in the desert before this other guy comes. I'm simply his, lead man. I'm going ahead of him. So he announces, I'm about somebody else. In John's life, John the Baptist's life, in his actions, they don't make any sense except in that relationship with Jesus. That's what he's doing. So that's meant to be true for us. Or that's supposed to be us. So who are we? I mean, today it's all about identities. I'm trying to craft my own identity or things like that. Who am I? Are we merely believers? As I was that first time I went into Mass after so many years? Or are we true disciples? So someone whose every other relationship flows from and is ordered by my connection with Jesus. And we all have those multiple relationships, right? They define who we are. But which is first? I mean, what's the primary relationship in that allows you to interact with these other relationships in a particular way? There's something that's driving us. So when I first arrived at graduate school there, I kept on going to Mass. I'd kind of come back to the faith, and I was on that trajectory. So I was still coming back. But I have to say that if you looked at my life, what my ambitions were, what motivated me, etc., what I thought my future was going to be, I was more of a Jack Green student than I was a Jesus Christ student in terms of discipleship. And I don't really blame myself at that point. That's just the route I was taking. But my primary relationship was, I'm a graduate student going to be a history professor under Jack P. Green. That's who I was. And I think it's a sign to me of my growing faith during those 5 years that eventually these relationships shifted. In the sense that halfway through I realized, Jesus was now my primary relationship. And out of that, it didn't necessarily have to be so, but in my case it was. Out of that, I discerned this call to the priesthood, that I was not going to be a history professor. And so I was going to finish what you start. So I finished my degree, but I realized I'm not going to try to get a job. Jack P. Green is no longer the number one guy. I still respect him. I need him in terms of that. But he's not number one. So what about you? I mean, I assume most of you are believers here, or you wouldn't be here, unless somebody just snuck in the back like I did. So there might be a few of you there. Welcome. But for most of us, it's good to have you back. But most of us, we're at least believers. But what's your primary relationship in life? I mean, besides being Catholic, you're also, lots of you, you're married, you're employed, etc., fathers and mothers, these sort of things. You have grandchildren, children. So what primarily defines you in your own mind? If you were going to say, okay, describe yourself. Here's 1, 2, 3. How are you going to describe yourself? These days, I probably say, who are you? I'm a Catholic priest. I'll probably be number one. But what about, are you the spouse? I'm the spouse of X, Y, or Z. Or I'm the mother or the child of this other person. Or sometimes it's more like, I'm the team leader. Or I'm the co-founder of the company. Or I'm the owner of the Lakeside House. And none of those things are bad. And they might be part of your identity. But those self-defining relationships with persons or things, they can't be first for a disciple of Christ. So a way to test this, I think, another nice question to sort of meditate on today. One of them is, again, what's my first relationship? If I had to describe myself, what would be the first thing you'd say? But also, we can ask ourselves, when my life that I'm currently leading and the way I conceive of myself, how much would it change if, in fact, what John the Baptist said about Jesus is not the truth, that he's not the Messiah, he's not God, he's not our Savior, that's all a mistake? How much of my life would really change? Because if my life would make sense without Jesus, then he's not my primary relationship. And this relationship doesn't happen all at once. Becoming a true disciple of Christ takes time. It did with me. So again, it's not judging about where the relationship is now. They're simply trying to reorient it so that it becomes, again, the right priorities. So it can take years for a relationship to Jesus to kind of blossom and float to the top. But it's where we're meant to be headed. That's if you want our lives to make sense, all the other relationships to kind of align, Jesus comes first, and serving him as his disciple comes first, and out of that, I look at my marriage, I look at my children, I look at my grandkids, I look at my job, and all those sort of things, and I get them good. So, are we disciples or are we believers? And Advent's a great time to examine this and honestly admit, as John the Baptist did, who we are and what our defining relationship is. And if it's not Jesus, there's good news. The good news is there, not that it's not the first relationship, you want that eventually, but the good news is, if he's not number one, there's so much life and happiness that God still wants to share with us if we'll only pursue him with all our hearts.